the afternoon of October 1997, the In Your House Bad Blood pay-per-view, Brett and Pillman are late to the building that day in St. Louis, so folks just assume they're all on the same plane, or these two guys are. You've told us before on the show that Brett would show up late to the building pretty routinely, but when Brett does show up and he shows up alone, people start to realize something was up. And Pillman had missed a few shows that summer, and folks were worried, and he had been in a car wreck just 2 months before and missed a show, and a lot of people were blaming painkillers and over-medicating himself for that. And supposedly, you guys called Melanie a half hour before the show to see what was up, because nobody had heard from him. And she said she hadn't heard anything either. And a short while later, the police notified her that they found his body, and a WWF official was able to recognize with the hotel that he had been discovered there.
Yeah, that's not exactly how it went down, but... Well,
correct it. Tell us what's up.
Brian didn't show up, and, we started asking guys, have you seen Brian? Initially everybody thought, well, he'd be on Brett's flight, and Brett said he wasn't on his flight, so we started asking, hey, did you see Brian? And guys, that had stayed at the hotel where Brian was, yeah, he stayed at our hotel. But he wasn't on your flight? No, didn't see him this morning. So I believe it was Jim Cornette called the hotel and asked if I had called Elliot Pollock, I think, first, and asked if he had heard from Brian and knew where he was. He hadn't heard from him. I said, well, I don't want to worry anybody, but he hadn't shown up yet. Corny called the hotel to see what time he had checked out, and they asked who he was, and they said, well, we need to speak to someone in an official capacity. I happened to be there, and he says, well, how about the vice president of talent relations? And stuck me on the phone, and they go, who are you? And I told them who I was, and they put me on with a police officer who told me that they had discovered Brian in his hotel room. And I'm just trying to process this, and I'm getting his name because, I'm being informed over the phone. I didn't know who the hell I was talking to.
Right.
Really. And I said, can I please get, your name, your badge number, and who I can contact there to confirm this. I hope you can understand. I'm not doubting what you're saying, but I need to do some more investigation before we go around saying that, this guy's gone. And then we went in and I talked to Vince, and JR was there, and Corny was there, and I called Melanie and asked her, I said, hey, you heard from Brian? And she said no. She had talked to him the night before. And I said, okay, well, if you hear from him, let us know. Here's the direct line back here. We hadn't heard from him. So I then called his agent and I said, hey, we got some disturbing news. I'm trying, and at the same time, I think we had somebody else trying to get a hold of the police department in Minnesota to verify this news.
The night before, he had wrestled Goldust in his last match ever in St. Paul.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we had probably Rich Herring or someone, or Linda or somebody, trying to get a hold of the police department there to verify the news and just try and find out what happened versus, talking to somebody in a hotel that you really, again, aren't sure who you're talking to. And while we're going through all this, the phone rings back, and it was Elliot who told us, hey, the police are at Melanie's house, I've got her on the other line, and they just let us know that Brian's gone. And you know, it's moments like that where it sucks. It really just sucks. It sucks to be in the position I was in, having information like that and not knowing for sure. You know, I've been told things that were wrong. You know, your buddy, the wrestling journalist expert, has reported people who passed who hadn't passed, and it happens. That happens, and I understand it. So I would always be very careful as far as repeating anything like that. And it was a closed circle, and I think the shittiest thing that happened was we were emotional. When I say we, I was emotional. Corny was emotional. Jim Ross was emotional. And I don't know if it's a knock or what, but I remember it upset me at the time, and I understand where he's coming from now, but it upset me at the time. It was Vince kind of snapping at us, basically, get your shit together. And it was in a matter of minutes that we had just learned that one of our colleagues and friends had passed. I had the shitty job of getting that news and being online with the guy while his wife is getting the news. It's not a fun, until you've been there, it's hard to explain, and it's hard to tell you the feeling and the emotion and the range of emotion you go through. And it was just tough. It was tough. And now we got to sit there and figure out, oh my God, you know, we're here. We got a show to do. And you got to make hard decisions, and you got to move forward. And it's nothing you say and nothing you do will be right. Everything will be second guessed by people that, you know, days after. But you're always second guessed by the people who have never been in that position to have to make those hard decisions. So to anybody that wants to second guess the decision or make comments about it, fuck you. You weren't there. You've never had to make those decisions, and I wouldn't wish it on anybody. So, I mean, that's what happened, and you know, we had to act pretty quickly and make some quick decisions, and decisions were made, and we decided to move on, and that Vince would make the announcement. And you got guys in the locker room who were with him the night before, who were his friends and his colleagues, his brothers and sisters, and there's a family, there's a wife and kids who just lost their dad and their husband, their son and their brother. So yeah, it sucks.
It's worth mentioning that when this happens, Melanie came into the relationship with 2 kids. Brian had 2 kids, and they had a son named Brian together. And when Brian passes away, she was pregnant. When they found him dead in his bed at the Budgetel Motel in Bloomington, Minnesota, the authorities found pill bottles, none of which were empty, and 1 empty beer. The pills were all, of course, prescription, muscle relaxers, and painkillers. There was no illegal drugs. There was no note. And I assume this was Soma's. Would you imagine?
I don't know. The official cause of death was a heart attack.
Yeah.
Brian died of a heart attack. And it wasn't a drug overdose.
I didn't say it was.
No, I know. I'm just making that clear. It wasn't
it is
drug
worth
overdose.
mentioning that is what everybody assumed, including Vince McMahon. That night on the pay-per-view, he actually said that on the pay-per-view.
Well, I don't think he said it was a drug overdose.
Well, I mean, he kind of did.
No, he didn't.
He says it's worth mentioning when you talked about Vince addressing the situation during the free-for-all segment prior to the pay-per-view, they shot something with Vince in his announcer outfit with the cage behind him backstage. And, he said, that Brian Pillman had passed away. Once the pay-per-view actually starts, he mentions it again while the Nation of Domination are doing their entrances. And when it was time for there to be a Brian Pillman Dude Love match on the card from Bad Blood, McMahon says, quote, authorities expect no foul play was involved in terms of the initial inspection. There are concerns about the possibility of a drug overdose, be it prescription or recreational. Of course, that is a problem in all sports and all forms of entertainment. That will not be definite for another 7 days when the toxicology report comes in and is made public. So he, on the pay-per-view, prepares his company, at least in my opinion, for what he knows will be the lambasting that, now one that's on your roster did it and overdosed. Because guys were passing away, even here, from drugs. But to have it happen on a pay-per-view and make this announcement, he knows he's going to have to address this.
Well, and again, but at the same time, too, you don't always... That's why I shudder when people, will either criticize it, second guess it. Man, it's within minutes, hours of finding this information. You don't have all the information. No matter what you say, no matter what you do, is going to be second guessed. And I guarantee he didn't. He made a decision. That's what he said. That's what he did. Okay, great.
But this is worth mentioning, though. When people say, because when I talked about there were pill bottles there and one empty beer, you went right to, hey, he died of a heart attack. And
well, he did. Because the assumption you automatically jump to in your mind, well, there were pill bottles, and there was a beer. The average person, me included, is going to jump to the conclusion, well, he OD'd.
Not just you included. Vince McMahon, the owner of the company, goes on fucking television after a guy dies from a heart attack and says,
we didn't know what he died of.
So why would you just fucking name, hey, there's a possibility of a drug overdose? Because
people are going to say just like you did, that there were pill bottles there, so he died of an OD. So address it up front. That's the only thing I can assume was his reasoning. I can't tell you Vince McMahon's reasoning for doing that.
Well, I can, because he says, of course, that is a problem in all sports and all forms of entertainment, which is code for, it ain't just us. It ain't just wrestling. People die in music. People die in the movies.
People die every day.
But the point is, Brian Pillman has this thing around him now in his death that is, it was a drug overdose. Vince McMahon is the person who put that in everybody's head.
Well, I think everybody had that in their head regardless of whether Vince put it there that night or not.
Now, you're saying that because you're inside the wrestling bubble. So everybody in the locker room may have thought that because they saw him stumbling and bumbling around the back. But when the
media did it, the media did as well. It's just like you do.
I do.
You're saying the same thing.
How am I saying the same thing?
By bringing it up.
I'm bringing it up to give your fucking former boss an out to excuse his bullshit decision here to just say on TV and speculate that it was about drugs. And he continued his bullshit the next day, and we'll get there in a minute. But I mentioned there was no note because the odds are real damn good. This was not a suicide. Obviously it was a heart attack, but Brian had a relationship with a woman who had a baby, and that woman struggled with depression and drug addiction. And then she eventually shot herself in the head while she was on the phone with her mom. And a big custody battle ensued between her mom and Brian. And when Brian dies, his daughter has no mother now. So it's doubtful that he would have ever done this intentionally. Obviously, he had a heart attack, so that doesn't matter. It comes out later that the night before at the St. Paul Civic Center, Ed Sharkey, who was a referee at the time, reported that Pillman kind of looked weird and then slept on the floor during the matches, which was not the norm for him. Reports are that he did have some drinks with the boys afterwards and was a little tipsy, but he didn't go out with them. He turned down their invitation and just went to his room, and he was in there before 11 p.m. He did leave a message at home on his home answering machine, and that was the last anybody ever heard from him. His dad died of a heart failure rather, at the age 50. This is weird. You guys replace this Brian Pillman Dude Love match with a mini tag match. Where do you find 4 Mexican midgets in St. Louis on a couple hours' notice?
They were there for TV the next day.
Okay. So they're supposed to keep this angle going with Goldust and Marlena renewing their vows and continuing this Brian Pillman rabbit hole thing they're doing. But they just disappear from TV for a bit, and then when they do reappear, they abandon that storyline altogether, obviously. And then in a sit-down interview with JR, Dustin is the one who wants out now. So they continue the breakup angle, but just from a different perspective. Meltzer wrote in the Observer that Ross had been counseling on a multiple time per week basis Pillman about his drug usage, and ordered him to undergo a drug test about a month before, 5 weeks before his passing away. And supposedly Pillman was furious about being singled out, since he had never gone on television loaded, and no one ever said he couldn't perform in or out of the ring. And he kind of compared himself to the state that Shawn Michaels had been in recent weeks, where that was more of an issue than maybe it was here. When this happens, supposedly, Pillman flips out and starts to blame his marital problems. Also worth mentioning, Melanie had asked Brian to go to rehab. He refused, and she eventually got a restraining order against him and filed for divorce. After a brief separation, he returned home, and then for a series in like September and October, he had to miss Friday night house shows because he was at a court-mandated anger management class on Saturday mornings, including the night he wrestled his last match with Goldust in St. Paul. What do you think about this whole JR drug testing him, his fallout with Jim Ross right here at the end? Because supposedly this led to him calling Bischoff all depressed and talking about not being happy with his position in the WWF and maybe coming back to WCW to join the Horsemen. Nothing ever came of that talk, of course, but what was your thought about Brian at the time when this whole Jim Ross thing?
Well, it wasn't just Jim Ross. It was his friends and his colleagues were concerned for his well-being. And so, yeah, he was singled out because there was reason to single him out because of his actions and because guys were concerned for his health and his well-being. So he was asked to take a drug test. You know, it's real simple. If you're not doing drugs and you say you're clean and you're okay, then there shouldn't really be an issue about taking a drug test. And I think Brian kind of felt that he was betrayed by JR and that he was being picked on because he was different, because he was living the gimmick. But I think, you know, guys were just concerned for him. So there was a drug test he was asked to take, see if he was on anything other than what he was being prescribed. Man, it came back that he wasn't.
I guess my question,
he took it.
I'm talking about the relationship between he and JR. Do you know if they...
I said he felt betrayed. I mean, he felt betrayed by Jim after that.
But do you think they passed it up before he passed away or no?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, who really knows? I think they did. I would hope so. I mean, Jim felt, I mean, God damn, he loved Brian.
Yeah. No, I'm not shitting on JR. I mean,
it's
he's
just,
trying to help.
Yeah, I would hope so. I would definitely hope so. I talked to Brian about it as well. Went through the whole thing with him.
And you probably had a different approach than a Jim Ross, and I'm not saying that from a shit.
Oh, I definitely had a different approach than Jim Ross. I've been there, done that. I've done them all. So I'm not going to sit there and throw stones. I live in a glass house. So